Right now, inside the White House Situation Room, a decision is being discussed that could redraw the map of the Middle East. It isn't about capturing a city or winning a battle. It's about one small island in the Persian Gulf, an island so important that a single strike could pull American troops onto Iranian soil for the first time in this conflict. If that happens, this stops being a Middle East story. It becomes the story that defines the rest of this decade. Because right now, at this exact moment, two things are happening at the same time that almost nobody is connecting. The first is that Washington is quietly debating a ground operation in Iran. The second is that 800 miles away, in a different sea, a completely different armed group just proved it can shut down global trade whenever it wants to. Two fuses, lit at the same time. And if either one reaches the explosive, the world does not get a regional war. It gets a global one. This is EndGame analysis, and today we are going to walk through exactly how close we are to that point, using only what has actually happened, not speculation. Because the honest version of this story is frightening enough without exaggerating it. No dramatized worst-case scenarios, no manufactured predictions dressed up as certainty. Just the actual reporting, the actual numbers, and the actual decisions currently sitting on the table in Washington, Tehran, and Riyadh, laid out so you can see the shape of the risk for yourself. Let's start with how we got here. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated air campaign against Iran, targeting military infrastructure and leadership, in an operation that became the opening shot of what is now 5 months later, still an active war. Within hours, Iran's Revolutionary Guard declared the Strait of Hormuz, the single most important oil choke point on Earth, no longer safe for international shipping. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply moves through that 21-mile waterway. It went dark almost overnight. For weeks, the world watched oil prices do things they had never done before. Brent crude, which usually moves $1 or $2 on a bad day, jumped by 65% in a single month. Analysts who make a living predicting energy markets started openly discussing numbers like $150 a barrel, $200 a barrel, numbers that would have sounded insane in January. Then, on June 18th, something changed. The United States and Iran signed a memorandum of understanding, a 14-point agreement designed to end the fighting and reopen the strait. And for a few weeks, it looked like it might actually hold. Oil prices fell back towards $70 a barrel. Tankers started moving again. The world exhaled. But here is the detail that almost nobody paid attention to at the time, and it is the detail that explains everything that has happened since. The memorandum never specified who would actually control shipping through the strait. It said the passage would be open. It did not say who would manage it, who would guide the ships, who had the final word if something went wrong. Iran read that ambiguity one way, the United States read it another way, and when two nuclear-adjacent powers each believe they are the ones in control of the same 21-mile stretch of water that is not a peace deal, that is a delayed argument. By early July, the argument restarted. Iran began firing on ships using the southern shipping route. The United States responded with strikes on Iranian coastal and military facilities. And on July 8th, during the funeral commemorations for Iran's late supreme leader, President Trump was asked directly whether the ceasefire was still in place. His answer was blunt. He said he did not want to deal with them anymore. He called them scum. Within days, the tit-for-tat exchanges that had defined February and March were back, and this time they escalated faster. By the following week, Trump had floated and then withdrawn a 20% toll on all cargo passing through the strait, an idea so aggressive that even America's own regional allies reportedly pushed back on it privately. The very next day, in a Fox News interview, he raised the stakes again, threatening to knock out Iran's power plants and bridges unless Tehran returned to the table. On July 11th, the strikes resumed in earnest, and they have not stopped since. As of this week, the Pentagon has confirmed the war has cost the United States $37.5 billion so far, with the administration requesting tens of billions more from Congress. 17 American service members have been killed. And for the first time since the war began, Washington is now openly discussing something it had avoided for 5 straight months, putting American boots on Iranian ground. Here is what we actually know, not what is rumored, not what is speculated, what has been reported directly from inside the process. According to the Wall Street Journal, President Trump convened a meeting in the White House Situation Room to discuss the potential seizure of Kharg Island and other territory along the Strait of Hormuz using American troops, as well as the potential bombing of a tunnel complex at a site the United States has not yet targeted. This was not a single conversation. It was, in the Journal's words, one of multiple formal and informal discussions the president has held in recent days about escalating the war. Kharg Island matters because it is not just any piece of land. It is the beating heart of Iran's oil export industry. the terminal through which the overwhelming majority of Iranian crude physically leaves the country. If the United States seized it, it would be a devastating economic blow to Tehran. It would also mean, for the first time in this entire war, American soldiers standing on Iranian territory, within range of Iranian artillery, missiles, and drones, in a small and highly exposed area. This is not a fringe idea. Retired Marine General Frank McKenzie, who ran American military operations across the entire Middle East from 2019 to 2022, said publicly on national television that seizing Kharg Island is something the United States should seriously consider because possession of Iranian soil would be a significant factor in any future negotiation. Now, to be fair to the other side of this, most former military officials are not describing this as the opening move of a full invasion. Analysts speaking to Foreign Policy this week said a true ground war, the kind that would require occupying Iranian cities, is not realistically on the table. The United States currently has roughly 50,000 troops in the region. A full invasion of a country the size of Iran, with a population over 80 million, would require dramatically more than that, and nobody credible in Washington is proposing it. What is being discussed is narrower. Seizing an island, targeted raids on specific military sites, limited operations designed to raise the cost of Iranian defiance without triggering the kind of full occupation that failed so catastrophically in Iraq. But narrow does not mean safe. And here is why. Iran has spent decades preparing for exactly this scenario. Its military fields an estimated 570,000 active duty troops and 350,000 reserves, backed by coastal missile batteries, naval mines, and swarms of fast attack boats designed specifically to make any foreign military presence in the Gulf as costly as possible. Even a small American footprint on an island like Kharg would put a concentrated number of troops within range of exactly the weapons Iran has spent years building for this purpose. And inside Iran itself, the political temperature is rising to match. Iranian hardliners are reportedly floating the idea of a counteroffensive, one that could involve Iranian forces moving against Bahrain and Kuwait if American troops set foot on Iranian territory. Whether or not that ever happens, the fact that it is being discussed publicly tells you how close both sides believe they are to a different kind of war than the one that has been fought for the last 5 months. This is the first fuse. Now let's talk about the second one, because it just went off less than 72 hours ago, and almost nobody outside the shipping and energy world noticed. While the world has spent 5 months focused entirely on the Strait of Hormuz, a second choke point has been sitting quietly at the southern end of the Red Sea. It is called the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, a narrow 20-kilometer gap that virtually all shipping between the Suez Canal and the Indian Ocean has to pass through. And on July 20th, the Iran-backed Houthi movement in Yemen announced something that should have made front-page news everywhere: a full naval blockade against Saudi Arabia. For a few days, it looked like it might be a threat without follow-through. It was not. On July 23rd and into the early hours of July 24th, the Houthis made good on it. They struck 2 Saudi oil tankers with missiles and drones. Saudi Arabia confirmed at least 1 direct hit on a refined products tanker. The British Navy confirmed a separate tanker was struck near the Saudi coastal town of Al-Shukaik. And the moment that news hit trading desks, the price of oil jumped past $100 a barrel for the first time since May. Understand what just happened here, because the significance is easy to miss if you are not watching the map closely. Saudi Arabia had spent the last 5 months routing much of its oil around the closed Strait of Hormuz entirely, using an overland pipeline to reach export terminals that did not depend on that choke point. It was, in effect, the one credible workaround the region had left. The Houthi blockade takes direct aim at that workaround. If Riyadh cannot move oil through Hormuz, and it cannot move oil through the Red Sea either, there is no remaining route that does not carry serious risk. The Council on Foreign Relations has already started calling this development by a name that should tell you everything. Another, Hormuz, and the timing is not a coincidence. The trigger, according to regional analysts, was a July 13th strike on Sanaa's international airport that prevented a sanctioned Iranian flight from landing, a strike widely attributed to Saudi Arabia. Iran, according to Washington Institute analyst April Longley Alley, was directly involved in facilitating the flight the strike was aimed at stopping. In her words, this was a brazen step by Iran to establish a new status quo in Yemen, one that draws its Houthi allies more directly into the broader war. Here's why this matters more than almost anything happening on the ground in Iran itself. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait carries roughly 7% of the world's oil supply. That does not sound like Hormuz's 20%, but stack a 7% disruption on top of an already crippled Hormuz, and you're no longer looking at a regional energy problem. You're looking at 2 of the world's most critical choke points choked at the same time, something the global shipping and insurance industry has never had to price for simultaneously in the modern era. And this is not the Houthis' first time doing this. This same group spent nearly 2 years, starting back in late 2023, attacking commercial shipping in the Red Sea in what they framed as solidarity with Gaza, forcing much of world trade to reroute entirely around the southern tip of Africa at enormous cost in time and fuel. They stood down from that campaign in 2025, after a truce brokered alongside the United States and the United Kingdom. What is happening now is not a new group learning a new tactic. It is a group that has already proven it can hold global shipping hostage, picking the exact same weapon back up, this time not over Gaza, but as a direct extension of Iran's war with Washington. That distinction matters. A group acting alone over a separate grievance is a regional nuisance. A group acting as a deliberate extension of Tehran's strategy, in coordination with Iran's own closure of Hormuz, is something closer to a second theater in the same war, opened on Iran's terms at a moment of Iran's choosing. And there is a deeper strategic problem buried inside this. Saudi Arabia has spent this entire war maintaining a careful, quiet diplomatic channel with Iran, one that has actually been useful. It was Riyadh that helped broker the ceasefire that briefly held back in June. By allowing the Houthis to strike at Saudi shipping, Iran is putting its own back channel to the one Gulf power capable of talking both sides down under direct strain. That is either serious miscalculation by Tehran or a deliberate signal that Iran is done, relying on diplomacy, and has decided escalation serves it better. Neither answer is reassuring. Let's talk numbers, because this is where the abstract turns into something that shows up in every gas station and grocery store on the planet. The World Bank's own commodity markets outlook described the Hormuz disruption as the largest oil market shock in recorded history. Global oil output fell nearly 7% year over year in the second quarter of 2026 alone, the sharpest quarterly collapse since the COVID pandemic shut down the entire world economy. Brent crude, which averaged around $85 a barrel in June, spiked back above $105 in the following weeks as the ceasefire collapsed, then briefly dropped again, only to jump past $100 once more on the Houthi tanker strikes this week. This is not a market finding a new stable price. This is a market that no longer has a stable price to find. And the forecasts for where this could go are not comforting. Energy analysts, including the chairman emeritus of FGE, one of the most respected independent energy consultancies in the world, warned earlier this year that a prolonged closure of the strait could push oil toward $150 to $200 a barrel. At that level, the economic models used by institutions like Bloomberg Economics show the damage roughly doubling compared to a more moderate spike, a stagflationary shock severe enough to reshape central bank policy across multiple continents and, quite possibly, the outcome of America's own midterm elections. This is where the Iran war stops being a story about Iran. Every economy on Earth that imports oil is exposed to this. Developing nations with limited fiscal space are already seeing wider current account deficits, weaker currencies, and rising borrowing costs directly tied to their oil import bills. According to the United Nations Trade Agency's own analysis of the crisis, this is not a war happening in a distant desert. It is a tax being quietly extracted from nearly every economy on the planet, whether or not those countries have a single soldier involved in the fighting. It is also not just oil. Gulf producers have cut output by more than 11 million barrels a day trying to manage the disruption, and that has pulled OECD oil inventories down to their lowest levels since 2003. One of the world's largest liquefied natural gas plants, in Qatar, has already sustained missile damage that its own operator says will take up to 5 years to fully repair. That is not a number that resets when a ceasefire is signed. That is years of lost energy capacity, baked in regardless of how the fighting ends. Every week this war continues without a durable resolution adds to a bill that outlasts the war itself. And the inflation math is not abstract either. Bloomberg's own economic modeling shows that at roughly $110 a barrel, the Eurozone alone would see close to a full percentage point added to annual inflation and a meaningful hit to growth. Push oil to $170, a level that is no longer a fringe scenario given what just happened in the Red Sea, and that damage roughly doubles. That is the difference between central banks holding steady and central banks being forced into decisions that ripple through mortgage rates, borrowing costs, and household budgets in countries that have nothing to do with this war. There is one more indicator worth watching closely, because it tells you what the most sophisticated investors on Earth actually believe is coming, as opposed to what they say in interviews. Gold hit an all-time high of $5,594 an ounce on January 29th of this year. Driven by the initial shock of the conflict and mounting pressure on the Federal Reserve, it then crashed more than 12%, one of the sharpest drops in 4 decades as investors took profits. But as of this week, gold sits around $4,050 an ounce, still up more than 21% from a year ago, and it has been climbing again, specifically on Iran war headlines, with traders explicitly citing the risk of a Federal Reserve rate hike driven by war-fueled inflation. What is more telling than the price itself is who is moving. Central banks and sovereign wealth funds around the world, from Azerbaijan's state oil fund to institutions across Asia, have been actively adjusting their gold positions specifically because of this conflict, some pausing sales entirely to avoid selling into a war-driven market they cannot predict. When central banks change behavior because of a regional war, that is not caution. That is a signal that the people whose entire job is managing national reserves see this as a risk to the financial system itself, not just to the price of oil. None of this is abstract for the people actually fighting it. 17 American service members have died in this war so far, according to Pentagon figures confirmed this week, including 3 killed just last weekend in a single incident. The New York Times has reported that the Pentagon may be withholding the true scale of American injuries, a claim the administration has firmly and publicly denied, insisting that of the roughly 100 service members treated for some degree of injury since early July, the overwhelming majority have already returned to duty. On the Iranian side, journalists and correspondents on the ground have reported casualty levels significantly higher than what the American side has experienced. Though verified, independent totals remain difficult to confirm given the restrictions on reporting inside the country. What is confirmed, through BBC World Service interviews with residents inside Iran, is that strikes on the electrical grid have knocked out water access for entire districts for a full week at a time, leaving residents describing hours spent waiting by a tap that does not run. This is the line that a ground operation would cross in a new way. Right now, this is a war fought almost entirely from the air and the sea. The moment American soldiers stand on Iranian soil, even on a single island, the character of this conflict changes permanently. It stops being a war Iran can absorb from a distance and becomes a war Iran's entire military doctrine, 570,000 active troops strong, has spent years preparing to fight directly. It is worth being careful here, because this is the part of the story where speculation tends to creep in disguised as analysis. What we can say with confidence is limited, but it is still worth saying plainly. Iran's international north-south transport corridor, the network of rail, road, and port links that gives landlocked and sanctioned economies a route to markets outside Western control, runs directly through Iranian territory. Any outcome that leaves Iran occupied, fractured, or economically broken beyond recovery removes that corridor for everyone who depends on it, not just Iran. That is a real strategic interest for Iran's partners, and it is reasonable to expect it shapes how closely they are watching a potential American ground operation. What it does not tell us is what any specific government will actually do in response. Predicting a formal military or nuclear commitment from a third party based on that interest alone would be speculation dressed up as certainty, and we are not going to do that here. What we can say is this: every additional week this war continues without resolution is a week in which non-Western capitals get to watch the world's largest economy struggle to close out a war against a country with a fraction of its military budget. That is not a neutral outcome for anyone invested in the current global financial order, dollar-based trade, Western-led institutions, sanctions as a tool of foreign policy. Whether or not it changes anyone's immediate behavior, it changes the story. Other governments are able to tell their own populations about whether that order is as durable as it looks. Here is the structural reason this specific decision, seize Kharg Island or don't, carries more weight than anything else in this war so far. Every escalation up to this point has followed a pattern. One side does something. The other side responds in a way it considers proportionate. The first side considers that response disproportionate. And so it escalates again. That is exactly how this war restarted in July. Tit for tat, missile for missile, strike for strike. It is a pattern that can, in theory, plateau. Both sides get tired. Both sides absorb the cost. Eventually, exhaustion forces a deal, the way it very nearly did back in June. A ground operation breaks that pattern entirely, because it does not fit into the tit-for-tat logic that has governed this war so far. There is no proportional response to foreign troops on your soil. There is only escalation or capitulation. And when you combine that with a Red Sea front that just opened, a Saudi relationship that is now under direct strain, an oil market already absorbing the worst shock, in recorded history, and a gold market signaling that institutional money no longer trusts this to stay contained, you get a set of conditions where a single decision in a Situation Room meeting does not just move the war forward. It could move the war sideways into new countries, new fronts, and new economic damage that no single ceasefire negotiation can undo. That is the honest read of where this stands today. Not a prediction that the worst outcome is guaranteed. A description of exactly how many independent fuses are burning at the same time, and how few of them are actually under anyone's control. The question now is not whether the Iran war has been costly. $37.5 billion and 17 American lives already answer that. The question is whether the next decision made in that situation room turns a costly regional war into something the global economy cannot root around, the way it has, so far, just barely managed to root around Hormuz. There's a version of the next few weeks where none of this happens, where the island stays untouched, where the Houthi blockade fizzles the way threats sometimes do, where exhaustion on both sides drags everyone back to a table the way it briefly did in June. That version is still possible. Nothing in what we have covered today makes it inevitable that this gets worse. But it is worth being honest about what has to hold for that calmer version to happen. No miscalculation on an island a general is already recommending. America take. No follow-through on a blockade a militia has already proven it is willing to enforce, and no third actor deciding that a distracted, overstretched United States is an opportunity rather than a warning. That is three separate things that all have to go right. At the same time, in a war that has already broken its own ceasefire once. Watch Kharg Island. Watch the Red Sea. Watch the price of oil and the price of gold together, because right now they are telling the same story from two different directions. If this breakdown gave you something the headlines didn't connect for you, subscribe to EndGame Analysis, because we are going to be tracking every one of these signals as they move. Tell me in the comments, do you think Washington takes the island? Or do you think this ends the way June almost did, with both sides too exhausted to go further? I read every comment, and they shape what we cover next. This has been EndGame Analysis. Stay sharp.